At the beginning of the 20th century, the country was changing in a way that could make all of Stanton and Anthony's work pay off.
You see larger and larger numbers of women who are entering factories, who are taking up paid employment, wage labor outside the home. And this leads to a real transformation in women's status.
Women began to campaign for better wages, limits on hours, and safer working conditions.
In the early 20th century, you begin to see a new generation of women's suffrage advocates emerging.
Carrie Chapman Catt was one of the leaders of the movement for suffrage.
She had good organizational skills, and the movement needed that.
Carrie Chapman Catt had a plan. To build support for the Anthony Amendment, she would first work to pass women's suffrage in a number of states.
And they actually have quite a number of successes, especially on the West Coast. So many of the Western territories or the Western states do, in fact, grant women the right to vote.
You had women who were voting for members of Congress, so you had a new kind of pressure.
So if you had to vote for a federal amendment and your state had said yes to suffrage in the state, you're probably going to be in favor of it.
At the same time that Catt was working with politicians, Alice Paul led a group that was beginning to make noise in the streets.
Alice Paul was a leader of the National Women's Party, and she believed in more direct action.
The suffrage movement in Britain in the early 20th century was an incredibly militant movement. They advocated tactics such as protests and marches. They went on hunger strikes. And Alice Paul learned a great deal from the movement in Britain, and she brought those lessons back to the United States.
Alice Paul led a massive march from the U.S. Capitol to the White House on the day before the inauguration parade of President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson ran against suffrage, and his supporters in town for the inauguration shouted at and assaulted the marchers. Over 100 protesters were hospitalized, and the army was called in to control the crowd. And once President Wilson was in office, the tension only grew worse.
They start with this idea of silent sentinels, as they called them. These were women who positioned themselves all over the White House lawn with signs such as, "How long do we have to wait, President Wilson?"
And they welcomed arrest. They experienced horrific conditions in prison. They were beaten, the prison cells were filthy, and after they went on the hunger strike for a number of days, they were force-fed. And all of this became very public, and a lot of people were outraged.
But when America entered World War I, instead of suspending the fight for women's equality, this time, Carrie Chapman Catt saw an opportunity. She encouraged her followers to make the cause of the war their own. They worked in factory jobs left vacant by men who went overseas to fight, and they joined the military as nurses, switchboard operators, and in other key jobs. President Wilson noticed
the great sacrifice women made during the war. He could not help but be moved by what had happened.
By 1918, President Wilson openly declared his support for a constitutional amendment granting women the vote.
Wilson goes to the Congress and speaks for it and talks about how important it is to the war effort, which he did do at the behest of Chapman Catt.
But Catt and Paul still faced a big obstacle.
In order to get the South on board, they assured Southerners that granting women the right to vote would not disrupt the racialized order in the South.
Black suffragists marched too, but to appease the South and President Wilson, they marched in the back.